This was your first time working with Martin Scorsese. Both of you have signature styles and a sizable legacy of work to boast of. How would you say working with him in creating this film's world was, and how did this collaboration work out?
I think Marty and I were brought together by a mutual friend, Paul Thomas Anderson. And when I first met Marty, he was excited about this project. He wanted to do a true telling of the Osage story. He'd already been involved for a couple of years and had written the script and was, it was important to him that he tell the story of the Osage and that they would, sort of bless it. And I love working realistically and naturalistically. And we got to shoot in Oklahoma where the story took place. So it was kind of haunted with the ghosts of the victims and the perpetrators, and their great grandchildren were walking around the streets still. It's a tragic story and part of American history that just has been forgotten. People hadn't studied it in school. And if you lived outside of Osage County, chances are you never heard of it, because 100 years of time, everything had just disappeared. And I find that a lot in history is that we lose track of what really happened. And I think it's important to keep revisiting our history so we don't continually make the same mistakes. Yeah. So I met Marty. We had the same goals. We were in the middle of COVID. So I only met him on a Zoom until February when he came out to look at locations that we'd chosen and see the sets, the designs for the sets. And we got along instantly. He once he got out to Oklahoma, he was there for the duration. And Rodrigo Prieto, the cinematographer, came out at the same time. And so we went around to a lot of locations and areas where we were going to build houses and sets, and it saved us a lot of time because we could talk through. Marty would tell us what he needed for shots he wanted to make, and Rodrigo and I would talk about the lighting and how to best place the structures. And we had similar tastes, like darker walls, like backlighting, and we were able in that area to give each of us what we needed and have that historical significance of being in the place 100 years later. They really wanted us to shoot in Oklahoma. It was important to them because they wanted to be around. They wanted to be a part of it. I think too often Native indigenous people are short-sighted or short-handed or short. They're given a short shift on the telling of their own story. And although we needed somebody like Marty to tell the story and to know how to present it, we needed the Osage to help us with the content and solidify the cultural aspect of the story. And it was nice. We were working with descendants of, one Osage artist, Addie Roanhorse, was in the art department, and her great grandfather was Henry Roan, who was shot in the back of the head in that red car in the film. So, they've been living with this for generations or for, their lifetime. And so it was important. The story took on importance to them. I mean, it always had importance to them, but it took on a more importance to us because it became very real.
Could you describe the role of the film's architecture and design in bringing your near-urban vision for the Fairfax Reservation alive?
That the street that we built for There Will Be Blood, it was an existing 2 blocks of buildings, but they were mostly derelict. Over the 100 years, they'd all sort of developed leaks in the roofs and it had rotted from the inside out. So we spent a bit of time resuscitating them and remediating, getting all the mold and stuff out so that we could use them. There were a couple of buildings that were decent inside, and we cleaned those out to use for some of the sets, like the pool hall and the restaurant and dance studio and the meat market. But a lot of them were just fronts, and we went and looked at a lot of photographs from the period. We were shooting in Pahuska, a derelict part of Pawhuska, but the story takes place in Fairfax. Pawhuska was a county seat of Osage County. Fairfax was a farm community. So I tried to bring everything down to the scale of Fairfax, which Fairfax had no buildings over 2 stories, and Pawhuska had some 5-story buildings. One of the buildings was in our 2 blocks, and we, with visual effects, we were able to take off 3 stories, get it back down into our scale. We added, we had to replace all the windows because the frames had rotted, and we got awnings to put on the windows, which was necessary then. They didn't have any air conditioning, so they were trying to block out the sun in the summertime as much as possible. We added electrical poles and electricity, and of course we put in graphics and dirt on the roads to bring them back. In the town of Fairfax, they didn't pave their main street until 1924, and our story started in 1919 and went to about 1925. So I just made a decision it would just be dirt roads in there, which they had in a farming community because it was easy for wagons to turn around, and the streets were wider then. But because of the influx of the car, the streets changed. And the streets in Fairfax were so wide that they would park cars down the middle of the street. We were trying to think of something exciting to be happening when we first talked about opening in the street of Fairfax. And I had an idea of a horse race because there were a lot of horse races. But then I read about these car races that would go from town to town. Cars were relatively new then, and they would run from city to city or town to town. And we decided that Marty loved the idea and put it into our film where there was actually a car race in progress. And it just added some excitement, and it also, in those farm communities on the weekends, everybody would come into town. They work 5 days a week, and Friday night and Saturday, they would all be in town. Sunday, they were all at church, but we chose to have it, one of those days where there was a lot of activity.
There are several Osage design motifs, chief among them being color, that stand out. In the context of the film, they appear to be pushbacks against white settler colonialism. How did you come about researching and designing these?
The irony is that the Osage have been known for loving color. When they got cars, they would paint them bright colors. There was when I looked at the old maps, there was a paint shop in Fairfax, and they would buy these black Fords or Buicks, and they'd have them painted whatever color they wanted. It was important to them. And by the time I got to Fairfax 100 years later, all the houses were white. It was like devoid of color. And so you had the prairie and that. So our team worked to try and get color back into the houses and into the interiors, and sort of, I felt like we were kind of resuscitating the Osage, and they were passionate. And the Osage, I got a book on Osage art. They were great artists from the beginning. So it was exciting to see it coming back, the color and the excitement about where they lived. The thing that excited me about this film when I first read it was the Osage people, the Native Americans, assimilating into a white world, that existed, and what they brought with it. They all had, I think they all had a great aesthetics. They were a communal group. They lived communally, before they lived in the towns of Oklahoma, and they appreciated fine art. I mean, they appreciated color. They did ribbon work in their clothing, and they did weaving. It was always brightly colors, and the money that they were making from the oil enabled them to find even prettier ribbons, and they would go to France or Switzerland and wherever to get the most colorful, aesthetically pleasing to them ribbons to put in their work. They also liked to travel. They liked cars like they used to like horses, and they loved being able to travel. They were, 100 years before our story, they were going every year. They were traveling out west to hunt buffalo and then coming back. So the idea of exploring and traveling was sort of in their soul. And they would go out on these trips in their car, the brightly painted car, and they'd see spode china or, some nice china, and they would, in paintings, and mostly china and stuff. They collected china and furniture and brought it back to their homes. And in Molly's home, we put that red and white spode china up on the walls and stuff because they would display it. They loved it so much. The wallpaper in her house was green based, but it was more, I wanted to do it more organic, like a plant, so that there wasn't a flat wall. And our decorator found this paper that I just loved, and it was green. It looked like you're inside a bush or something. And the clothing, Jackie West researched and found a lot of the old blankets, and they were always colorful. Matter of fact, they would use those blankets, the colors that they liked. They would show the paint shop, say, I would like my car painted this color if you could. And then they lived interesting life as they had these houses that were encouraged for them by the government, but they also would build native structures out in the yard. And they would go out there in the summer because homes didn't have a central air conditioning, so they get very hot. And they'd open them up as much as possible. They tend to spend their resting time out in these native structures that were open on the sides. They put a canvas on the top to get shade. And it just is a natural phenomenon that breeze would, like flow through them. And they were actually then also able to place them closer to the water where they would get some coolness from the water. So they cover at that time, the older generation was still living as much as they could in the past. And the young kids were, marrying white people and getting out and exploring. So it was a combination of two worlds. Our family, the Burkharts or Molly, it was actually the Kyles. They were a traditional Osage family. They weren't modernists. They didn't aspire to living in town. They lived on the reservation, Gray Horse, and about 5 miles from Fairfax. And Molly later moved into Fairfax because she was ill and she wanted to be closer to doctors and have the conveniences of indoor plumbing and electricity. But it was fun putting it together, and it was fun showing their appreciation for everything from furniture to wallpaper to china to cars. And I think my hope in designing the film was that would tell us a little bit more about the Osage people.
A particular sequence of the film transcends into a certain metaphysicality, as opposed to the film's otherwise rustic, grounded feel. What role would you say production design had to play in this surreal transition?
Well, that was a great scene where the wardrobe and makeup dressed the ancestors that were in the afterlife to come and pick up her mother. But the biggest thing about it was the lighting and the cinematography change. That Rodrigo made the color more intense, and it just didn't fit with the rest of what we'd seen, before and after. So that with the strangeness of the costumes and familiarity of the costumes and the people themselves and the kind of relaxed way that they led her to this next life, I think all contributed. But the lighting, the way the film is processed, probably had a big effect on telling the story that you don't realize. Physically, I had not that much to do. It was mostly wardrobe, acting, and lighting, the printing of the film. But I thought it was effective and important part of the storytelling. Marty tried to incorporate Osage memories and feelings as much as possible. Another scene that we did was relayed to us by Addie Roanhorse, that when her mother died, her daughter walked across the casket of her mother. And I think that, I can't remember exactly because it's been a couple of years, but it had to do with the grandchildren not fearing death and not fearing the death of their grandparent. And when Marty heard this story from Addie, he put it into the script, and he did that continually as we learned bits and pieces that had sustained over centuries, decades. He tried to incorporate that into the story to tell us more. The whole idea was to tell us more about the Osage. I think he wasn't making the film so much for the Osage as he was for all of us, the general public, to understand the Osage. So he was able to work with them, and he wasn't telling them anything new, but he was telling the rest of the world new things about the Osage.
While you commit to constructing full buildings for habitation as opposed to a front, how would you say you bring out the aspect of age and time weariness, a patina of lived-in experience, to your designs?
What I was able to do on this film, the houses of Molly and Hale, was put them out far enough into the prairie that we saw nothing that took us out of the time of the film. There were no modern structures visible to the human eye. And I do like to build complete buildings so that you can incorporate the inside and the outside. I like to build them as early as possible in pre-production so they get some natural weathering and age. I mean, we were in an area that was, they call Tornado Alley because of the tornadoes that come through. So we had to build structures tough. And we were able to buy set dressing. It was cheaper than renting it, shipping it to Oklahoma, and keep paying all the rent, because our sets, once we built them, they stayed up till the end of the shoot. And we had to build roads to get into them because they were so far into the prairie. But the living in it is something that I just personally love. When I was a young boy, I lived in a house up in Vermont that had no electricity and no running water. It had a spring out back, and there was a pipe that brought it to a trough on the side of the house. But it made me think about how people live then, without electricity, and the lives change, and how much they like cooking, how much suddenly the Osage had money so they could hire white women to cook for them or to clean their house. So they didn't have to do that, but they still would cook outside and do sort of special treats for their friends. And the Osage, coming from a communal background, welcomed everybody. And when we built her house, Lizzie and Molly's house, I wanted porches surrounding it because they could put beds out there in the summer and people could sleep. And in every bedroom, there was 2 or 3 beds so that if anyone came, they could stay, and they could stay as long as they wanted. Lizzie's house was on the Gray Horse Reservation, and they would have ceremonial dances there every year, and family, friends, relatives would all come, and then they would stay with, the people that had homes in that area. So there's a scene in the film that Marty takes a Steadicam and walks through the house, does a full circle, and you realize the house is not that big, but there's so much activity going on. It's like preparing for a big party or something, and I love the excitement of that. So a lot of it comes just from natural aging. Some of it comes from sort of understanding how people live, and other thing is trying to not be too perfect. And when you think about the period, don't think about the year of the film, but think about 20 years before, because all of us, in our lives are living. I still wear the same clothes I wore in art school, and we've lived on a farm for 45 years, and it doesn't seem like it's changed, but I know it has, but you watch trees grow up, and we were able to find locations where there were some large trees, and there was a stream, and it had a lot of the elements of the placement of their original home in Gray Horse. And I wanted to preserve that as much as possible. Yeah. So it's nature helps us a lot.
Were there any literary references from David Grann's original book that helped you imagine and build the film's world?
The book helped me I read the book first, and that was really helpful. I got an idea of what was happening. I was a little surprised when I showed up in Fairfax and there were no mansions and there were no car dealerships that sold pace arrows, and there never were any there. That sometimes the rumor or the urban legends of the rich Osage altered the facts. When I got there, I found the houses pretty humble. I mean, they were craftsman houses from from the 20s and teens. But like I said before, when I saw them, there was no color in them. And David Grann gave us all of his research. He put together the books. And because of COVID, we didn't start shooting. I first talked to Marty about the job in April. We didn't start shooting until a year later. And we didn't start prepping the film until January, after that April. And so it gave me a lot of time to go through the research. And I going through David Grann's research. I was reading court cases of Molly and and her sisters and her mother, and I found out so much information that was helpful. Molly was questioned at the probate of her mother when she died. Where do you live? Do you have a house? Where do you live? She says, no, I don't have a house. I live with my mother. And they said, where's that? And it says, in Gray Horse, where I've lived there since I was born. So suddenly I was David Grann was never able to tell us what Molly's house looked like. And then I was able to find her house, but it was so small and it had been altered, in 100 years and gone down. So I started researching other Osage homes that existed and were recorded in photographs, and used those elements to come up with a house for Molly that would be representative of Osage families of that period. They had a large family. I mean, it was four girls and a mother and father, so there was 6 of them, and they all were entitled to their share of the wealth from the oil. So it was a very wealthy family, but they lived humbly. And I read that the Osage never referred to themselves as wealthy and rich, and they weren't used to bartering with money. It was they grew up in a system where you might trade this handiwork for that, and you shared a lot of stuff. I even read that before they moved to the Indian Territories, which became Oklahoma, they didn't have a word for mine. They didn't know how to say that's mine. And the United States government had all the indigenous tribes, they allocated the land. So they gave, everybody 160 acres. So suddenly they were in possession, and it created a different feeling amongst these communal families. The Osage were pretty smart. A lot of them had been educated in Pennsylvania and Kansas, and they negotiated with the government to have all their land given to each individual. There were 2,229 Osage at the time, and they ended up getting about 650 acres each. But that 650 acres was divided up all over the county, so they couldn't really use it. And it was to encourage them to sell to white settlers or foreigners that would come in. And the idea of having a division of land really changed the structure of their life. And the traditional Osage held on to it for as long as they could, but because their children were marrying into white families, and the white families were indoctrinating them into having possessions and stuff, everything changed. It was kind of a hard part of their life. And I think sometimes I've talked to Osage, and they think that we might have been better off if we didn't have the oil, if we didn't have that money.